On the morning of March 21st, 2026, a woman named Yael was walking her 7-year-old son to school in the Florentine neighborhood of Tel Aviv. She never made it, not because a missile hit her, not because she was injured, but because halfway down the street her phone screamed, the siren app, red alert, incoming, and she grabbed her son, pressed him against the wall of a building, and covered his head with her body. Because there was no shelter close enough, because the warning time was 11 seconds, and because on that particular morning, on that particular street, the threat falling from the sky was not a ballistic missile warhead, it was something worse. It was submunitions. Dozens of small, unguided bomblets already dispersed in the air above her, falling independently, unpredictably, with no warning system capable of tracking each individual piece. The interception had already happened. Somewhere at altitude, an Israeli aero battery had fired. The main missile body had been destroyed. The engagement had been logged in the Defense Ministry's system as a successful interception, and the submunitions were still falling. That gap between what the interception system counts as a success and what lands on a street in Tel Aviv is what this video is about. And once you understand how cluster munitions work, and why Iran introduced them into this conflict, and what they mean for Israel's ability to protect its cities going forward, you will understand why the official narrative around this conflict is not just incomplete, it is structurally misleading. Let's start with the weapon itself, because most coverage assumes the audience already understands it, and that assumption is wrong. A standard ballistic missile carries a single warhead. It travels from launch site to target in a predictable arc. If an interceptor destroys it at altitude, the threat is neutralized, the debris falls, the ground below is safe from the warhead's intended effect. A cluster munition warhead operates on an entirely different principle. The missile body is essentially a delivery vehicle, a container. Inside that container are dozens, sometimes hundreds, of smaller submunitions. Bomblets, each one individually capable of killing or injuring anyone within its blast radius. Each one designed to arm itself on impact or proximity. The cluster shell is designed to open during descent, typically at a preset altitude above the target area, and release those submunitions across a dispersal pattern that can cover several city blocks. Here is the critical operational reality that changes everything about how you evaluate an interception. If the defensive system intercepts the missile before the cluster shell has opened, the submunitions are destroyed along with the main body, clean intercept, threat neutralized, but if the cluster shell has already opened, if the submunitions have already been released into their dispersal pattern before the intercept occurs, then destroying the main missile body does nothing to stop what is already falling. You can fire your interceptor, you can achieve a direct hit, the engagement computer logs a kill, and 47 bomblets are already in freefall over a residential neighborhood, unguided, unpredictable, and completely outside the engagement envelope of any defensive system Israel currently operates. That is not a scenario. That is what happened in Tel Aviv on March 21st. That is what happened in Holon, in Bat Yam, in neighborhoods across central Israel during waves 5 and 6 of Iran's 8-wave barrage. Iran did not introduce cluster warheads in wave 1, or wave 2, or wave 3, or wave 4. They introduced them in wave 5. That sequencing was not accidental. Nothing about the structure of this 24-hour operation was accidental. And the decision to hold cluster munitions until the midpoint of the barrage tells you something very specific about how Iran's strategic planners think. Waves 1 through 4 served a purpose. They forced Israel's defensive network to engage continuously, to burn through interceptor stockpiles, to keep batteries hot and operators at their stations without meaningful rest cycles. By the time Wave 4 was over, Israeli air defense commanders were already managing a stockpile depletion problem. Wave 5 introduced cluster munitions into an air defense system that was already resource constrained, and the introduction of cluster munitions did something specific to the engagement calculus. It forced Israeli defensive planners to prioritize interceptions at earlier points in each missile's trajectory before the cluster shell could open, which requires engaging at longer ranges, which reduces intercept probability, which requires firing more interceptors per threat to compensate. In other words, cluster munitions made every subsequent interception attempt more expensive and less reliable simultaneously. And here is the dimension of this that nobody is covering. Israel's air defense radars and battle management systems can track a ballistic missile. They can calculate its trajectory. They can cue interceptors and manage the engagement sequence with extraordinary precision. They cannot track individual submunitions after cluster shell opening. 47 bomblets dispersing across 2 kilometers of airspace at terminal velocity are not a trackable target set for any system currently deployed. They fall, they land, some detonate on impact, some do not detonate immediately. They sit, armed, waiting, in gardens, in parking lots, on rooftops, in the spaces between buildings where children play. Israeli bomb disposal teams on March 21st were not responding to missile impact sites. They were conducting systematic neighborhood searches for unexploded submunitions across central Tel Aviv, across Bat Yam, across Rishon Rishon LeZion, street by street, garden by garden, every undetonated bomblet a potential casualty waiting for a child to find it. That is the ground truth of what cluster munitions do to a city. And it received approximately 4 minutes of coverage in a news cycle dominated by interception percentage statistics. Let's be specific about what left exposed means in the context of Tel Aviv on March 21, 2026. It does not mean the city was undefended. Israel's layered air defense architecture, Arrow at high altitude, David's Sling at medium altitude, Iron Dome at short range remained operational throughout the 24-hour barrage. Interceptors were firing. Engagements were occurring. The system was functioning. What it means is that by Wave 5, the system was making decisions that no air defense system should ever be forced to make. Triage decisions. When your interceptor inventory is under pressure, when you have consumed a significant percentage of your high-altitude interceptors across 4 consecutive waves and the 5th wave is already inbound, your battle management system begins to prioritize. It has to. There are not enough interceptors to engage every threat at the optimal point in its trajectory, so the system makes choices. This missile is targeted at a military installation. High priority. Engage early with Arrow. This missile's projected impact point is open desert. Lower priority. Allow it to descend further before engaging, conserving high-altitude interceptors for higher priority threats. This missile is carrying a cluster warhead and is targeted at a populated area, but the intercept window for stopping it before shell opening has already closed. What does the system do? It fires anyway, because the alternative is worse. But it fires knowing that even a successful interception at this point in the trajectory does not prevent the submunitions from reaching the ground. That calculation, that terrible, forced, unavoidable calculation, happened multiple times on March 21st. And the result was streets in Tel Aviv where bomb disposal teams spent the following day searching for unexploded ordnance. Streets where parents kept their children inside. Streets that were, in the most literal operational sense, left exposed. Not because the defense system failed, but because the defense system was being operated at the edge of its capacity against a threat that was specifically designed to exploit the gap between successful interception as a statistical metric and streets safe from falling munitions as an actual protective outcome. Here is the dimension of the cluster munition story that will persist long after this conflict ends, whenever it ends, and that is receiving almost no coverage right now. Cluster submunitions have a failure rate. Not every bomblet detonates on impact. Manufacturing variance, ground surface conditions, angle of impact, a percentage of every cluster munition dispersal pattern results in undetonated submunitions that sit armed, waiting. In military conflict zones outside urban areas, this is a documented humanitarian catastrophe that plays out over decades. In Laos, unexploded American cluster munitions from the Vietnam-era bombing campaign are still killing and injuring people more than 50 years later. In southern Lebanon, cluster munitions from the 2006 conflict continue to cause civilian casualties. Tel Aviv is not a conflict zone in a remote rural area. Tel Aviv is one of the most densely populated urban environments in the Middle East, apartment buildings with underground parking, rooftop gardens, children's playgrounds within meters of every residential building, the kind of urban density where an undetonated bomblet sitting under a hedge in a communal garden is not a remote risk, it is a statistical near certainty of eventual discovery by a child. Israeli bomb disposal teams on March 21st recovered and neutralized dozens of unexploded submunitions across central Tel Aviv and surrounding municipalities, but the teams themselves acknowledge that complete clearance of the affected areas to a standard where parents can be confident their children are safe will take weeks of systematic search operations across neighborhoods that were under cluster munition dispersal during waves 5 and 6. That is the hidden cost of cluster munitions in urban environments, the cost that does not show up in the 24-hour casualty figures. The cost that continues accruing after the last siren sounds, the contamination of urban space that is supposed to be safe, permanent until it is not, a playground until someone finds out the hard way that it isn't. Let's pull back now from the technical details of cluster munitions and look at what their introduction into this conflict means at the strategic level. Before March 21st, Iran's ballistic missile threat to Israel was, and I want to be precise about this, devastating in potential but theoretically manageable through layered air defense, if Israel maintained adequate interceptor stockpiles and if American resupply remained available. The introduction of cluster munitions changes that equation in 3 specific ways. First, it raises the interception threshold. Intercepting a cluster munition warhead before the shell opens requires engaging at greater range and altitude than intercepting a conventional warhead. This increases the per-interception cost in Arrow and David's Sling munitions, the expensive systems at the expense of Iron Dome, the cheaper system. Iran, in other words, is using cluster munitions to force Israel to burn through its most expensive and most difficult to replace interceptors at a faster rate. Second, it creates a ground contamination problem that air defense cannot solve. No matter how sophisticated Israel's interception systems become, they cannot intercept submunitions already in dispersal. The ground contamination problem is structurally outside the solution set that air defense technology addresses. The only way to prevent submunition contamination of Israeli cities is to intercept cluster warheads before shell opening every time with zero failure rate. That is not achievable at scale, at the interceptor consumption rates currently being observed, with the stockpile levels currently available. Third, and this is the dimension that has the deepest implications, the introduction of cluster munitions into the engagement mix signals something about Iran's strategic calculus going forward. Iran used conventional warheads for the first 4 waves. The transition to cluster munitions in Wave 5 was not driven by target selection logic. Cluster munitions are not more effective at destroying military installations or hardened infrastructure than conventional warheads. They are more effective at one thing: denying safe use of urban space by civilian populations. That is their military utility in this context, not destruction, denial, the denial of normal civilian life in Israeli cities. The imposition of a contamination problem that persists after the barrage ends. The psychological weight of a city where the all clear does not mean the danger is over. The question that Israel's military planners and political leadership are now confronting is a question that has no comfortable answer within the current strategic framework. Iran has demonstrated over the course of one 24-hour operation a capacity to sustain 8 waves of ballistic missile fire while introducing escalating technical complexity maneuvering warheads in Wave 3, cluster munitions in Wave 5, mass simultaneous salvos in Wave 7 in a sequence that systematically exploits the limitations of Israel's defensive architecture. The interceptor stockpile problem has not gone away. The production rate of Arrow interceptors in the United States, 6 to 8 per month, cannot restore what was consumed on March 21st in any time frame relevant to the current conflict tempo. American stockpiles drawn down by 2 years of supporting Ukraine's air defense requirements are not a substitute reserve that can be rapidly transferred. And Iran has now demonstrated that it can threaten Israeli urban areas not just with warhead impacts, which air defense can, with sufficient resources, largely prevent, but with ground contamination through cluster submunitions that persists after every interception. The clean equation fire interceptors, stop missiles, protect cities, is no longer clean. The new equation is harder. Fire interceptors, stop most missiles, except that cluster submunitions from partially or fully intercepted warheads will contaminate urban areas anyway, conduct weeks of bomb disposal operations in densely populated neighborhoods, and do all of this while the interceptor stockpile continues declining at a rate that production cannot replace. On March 21st, a woman named Yael pressed her 7-year-old son against a wall in Tel Aviv while bomblets fell from a sky where an interception had already been logged as successful. The Defense Ministry's numbers said the system worked. Yael's street said something different, and until the gap between those two statements is honestly addressed in policy, in procurement, in strategic decision-making, and in the coverage that the public actually receives, the streets of Tel Aviv will remain exposed, not to failure, to a form of success that does not protect them. That is the story of March 21st, 2026, and it is not over.